In today's video, we are going to learn about learning and memory from A Students A to Z of Psychology by V. Deventer. Our memories are an essential part of who we are. We rely on information in memory for almost everything we do, without realizing how much we depend on it. Without our memories, we would struggle to establish our identity and we would have a great deal of difficulty functioning in everyday life. Memory is affected by many factors such as age, physical health, and kind of activities we do. There is a wide range of what is considered normal memory. Some of us remember things well, and others have difficulty in remembering things. Memory is an active process that stores, organizes, and retrieves information. Memory involves three important phases. Encoding is the first one, or getting information into memory, then storage, keeping things in our memory, and the last phase is retrieval, or drawing information from memory store. The first phase of memory is encoding. Encoding refers to the process of forming a memory code. If we compare memory to a computer, encoding is similar to transforming information into a code of numbers or letters by entering data using keyboards. Attention is a very important aspect of remembering things. For example, if you sit through a meeting or a class and do not pay attention, you are very unlikely to remember things. But if you pay attention and focus, you will remember most of the stuff. You select what is relevant and you are likely to remember it. There are different strategies to improve our memory by making encoding more effective. The first of these is elaboration or linking one fact to other bits of information. You can do this by thinking of example that illustrates an idea. Second, Secondly, another way of improving encoding is through using visual imagery. You can create pictures or visual images of things you want to remember. Third part is encoding is easier when you can make the information personally meaningful. For example, you read that fear can develop through classical conditioning, and you apply this to your own fear of snake. By applying this information to your own experience, you are likely to remember what classical conditioning is. When the information is encoded, it is available for further processing in the brain. If information is not encoded, it will not be remembered in the future. Encoded information is ready for storage in memory. Storage involves holding or maintaining information in a memory store. If we think about computers again, storage is similar to saving information in a file on a computer's hard disk. We can store information in short-term memory or long-term memory. Sensory memory. Information is kept in its original sensory form for a very brief time, a fraction of a second. It is so brief that you are often only aware of an after image rather than the stimulus itself. We do not remember everything we see and hear in sensory information. Information is held in sensory memory just long enough for a part of it to be selected for a longer storage. Short-term memory. Short-term memory is a temporary store for small amounts of information. Short-term memories are encoded as images or as sounds. We keep information in short-term memory for approximately 20 seconds. However, you can keep information in short-term memory for much longer if you keep rehearsing it. Rehearsal is the repeatedly verbalizing or thinking about information. Short-term memory capacity can be increased by breaking down large amounts of information into smaller chunks. Short-term memory is not just a temporary storage place where information that is rehearsed is passed on to a long-term memory and information that is not rehearsed is lost. Recent research has revealed that there is a kind of short-term memory called working memory that help us to cope with new situations and to solve problems. Badley suggested that there are various components of working memory. A phonological loop. This allows access to verbal information or sounds. For example, if you wanted to recall a telephone number, it would be accessed via phonological loop. A visuospatial sketchpad. This allows you to manipulate visual images. For example, if you want to work out another route home to avoid traffic, you would use your visuospatial sketchpad. The executive control system. This controls, monitors, and regulates the information needed for reasoning and problem solving. Long-term knowledge stores. Sometimes you need to draw information from long-term memory for use in solving a particular problem. For example, you may be struggling to operate a new cell phone and you draw on information in your long-term memory where the knowledge of how you operated a previous phone was stored in order to solve a problem with your new phone. Long-term memory is another type of how we store information in our brains. Long-term memory is the store where information is held for a longer period of time. The capacity of long-term memory is believed to be unlimited and we can remember an astounding amount of information. There are different types of long-term memories. The main division is between declarative and non-declarative or procedural memory. The declarative memory system refers to store of explicit factual information. For example, information about names, places, facts, and events is stored in declarative memory. There are further two types of declarative memories: semantic memory and episodic memory. Semantic memory refers to store of general knowledge, such as who is the president of country, as well as the meaning of words and the relationship between words and concept. Semantic memory is not related to the specific time when the information was learned. However, episodic memory refers to remembering events and personal information that are related to specific times, such as what you were doing when Nelson Mandela was released from prison. Second type of long-term memory is non-declarative memory system. Non-declarative memory system deals with action, perceptual motor skills, conditioned responses, and implicit memories. It is also called procedural memory. Memory for procedural or perceptual motor skill is mostly unconscious in the sense that we are not consciously aware of it. For this reason, it is also called implicit memory. Retrieval describes the process of getting stored information out of the memory. Retrieval is made easier when we have cues of something that help us to access our memory. When we have difficulty remembering, it also helps if we recreate the context of whatever it is we are trying to remember. There are, for example, steps to find keys. There are cultural influences on the ways in which we encode information and events and how easily they are remembered. For example, some people learn by telling stories or speaking words orally. Forgetting is another phenomena. Forgetting refers to process of being unable to retrieve the information we have stored in the memory. Some reason for person to forget things include tip of tongue phenomena, ineffective encoding, decay, interference, retrieval failure, and motivated forgetting. Tip of tongue phenomena refers to the temporary inability to remember something, although we are sure we know that information, but still we can't remember it. Ineffective encoding means sometimes we think that we have forgotten something when in fact we have actually never remembered it. This happens when we don't pay enough attention. Decay is When memory traces fade away over time, complex and meaningless information decays faster. We are more likely to remember the things that are important to us or have personal meaning. Interference. One of the reasons why we forget information is that there is a competition from other material that interferes with the memory process. Retrieval failure. Sometimes you remember things that you could not remember before. This may be because the situation you are in provides a good cue of what you want to remember. The more similar the cue is to the memory code, the easier it is to remember. Motivated forgetting. Sometimes we want to need to forget something. In other words, we have internal motivation to forget something. For example, you may want to forget an incident in the past, such as when you have behaved badly at a friend's party, or because it embarrasses you and you feel bad that you remember it. If you need to memorize information, some of the ways to improve your memory skills are recitation. By summarizing aloud while you are learning, you not only provides instant feedback, but you also practice retrieving the information you are learning. Rehearsal. The more you rehearse, the better you will remember when you rehearse. Selection. Select keywords or important facts to provide cues for the information you need to remember. Organization. Organize information into smaller or more manageable chunks. Whole learning. Try to learn an overall scheme of what you learn to learn rather than concentrate on the separate part. Serial position is also one of the way to improve memory. When you have to learn bits of information in a sequence, remember that you are likely to make mistake in the middle of the sequence or list. So you have to pay particular attention to the bits in the middle. We tend to remember things that come first and last better than those in the middle. Cues and strategies. Try to add cues to what you are learning. If you cannot remember a fact, use a strategy such as working through the alphabet to prompt retrieval of information you need. Overlearning and review. When you have acquired the information, learn it again and make sure you have it. Review the information again shortly before you have a test. Spaced practice. Alternate your study session with brief rest period to make sure that you are paying attention of what you are learning. Sleeping and eating. Sleeping after learning helps to consolidate the remembered material. You are likely to perform well if you are unlikely to perform well if you are hungry. We all have general idea of what learning is, even though we may find it difficult to define. Learning is formally defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience. This implies that we can see that learning has taken place when there is a behavior change. The change in behavior has to be relatively permanent, which means that it must be long lasting and it must be the result of any experience. Our behavior may change because of temporary conditions such as illness, tiredness, or decreased motivation. But this kind of behavior change is not the result of learning. When learning has taken place, the change in behavior is long lasting and is caused by a certain experiences. Most human behavior is learned behavior. It would be hard to imagine what life would be like if we lost everything we learned. We would not know how to speak, to interact with others, or to write, and to do things we enjoy. Generally speaking, there are three types of learning. The first is called associative learning because learning takes place by associating one thing or events with another. Classical and operant conditioning are forms of associative learning. The second type of learning is called cognitive learning because learning involves thinking. The third type of learning is social learning, which refers to the way we acquire social behavior. Conditioning is kind of learning that happens on an automatic level. We do not deliberately learn a conditioned response. Classical conditioning. Classical conditioning refers to types of learning that take place when a response usually elicted by one stimulus is then associated with different stimulus that would normally not lead to that response. This sounds complicated. The first person to provide experimental proof of classical conditioning was Ivan Pavlov, a Russian scientist who studied the digestion of dogs. He said dogs salivate when hearing a bell ring. Classical conditioning occurs when a response, such as salivating, due elicted by one stimulus, smell or sight of food, is then associated with different stimulus, bell ringing, that wouldn't normally lead to that response. Bell wouldn't really lead to a salivation response in the dog salivation when hearing a bell ring case. Thus, a new behavior response has been learned, for example, salivating when you hear a bell ring. This is an example of classical conditioning. We can break down the elements of classical conditioning as follows: unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. These are the four elements of classical conditioning. An unconditioned stimulus means that it is not conditioned or not associated with something. This is a stimulus that causes the subject to respond in a specific way before any learning has taken place. In the example of Pavlov's experiment, the food is unconditioned stimulus. Right from the beginning, the food caused the dog to salivate. An unconditioned response. This is a response to an unconditioned stimulus. Dogs automatically produce saliva to aid digestion when they see or smell food. Salivation is not a conditioned or learned response. Third one is a conditioned stimulus. This is a stimulus that initially is neutral, but through association, that is, being paired with an unconditioned stimulus, it may produce the desired response when they present it without the unconditioned stimulus. In Pavlov's experiment, the bell is conditioned stimulus. At first, the bell would not produce salivation in the dog. However, when it was rung, just before the food was presented, the dog became conditioned to the fact that bell signaled that food was coming. After they had made this association, the dog salivated when they heard the bell, even if they couldn't see or smell food. The bell became the conditioned stimulus. The dog learned that it was associated with food, unconditioned stimulus. Last one is a conditioned response. This is the response that follows the conditioned stimulus. At first, salivation was unconditioned response to food. It happened automatically. After the bell was paired or associated with food, the bell became the conditioned stimulus. The dog's salivation after hearing the bell therefore became the conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus, the bell. In this way, salivation became a learned or conditioned response because a bell would not normally trigger salivation. Classical conditioning can take place in humans as well. Certain phobias or irrational fear are the result of classical conditioning. For example, Tom leaves room every time he sees a cat because he is allergic to them. In this case, cat hair is unconditioned stimulus. Sneezing is the unconditioned response. Cat is conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response is when he leaves the room. Leaving the room is the conditioned response. Likewise, Kate felt terrified when she got attacked on the bus. Now every time she sees a bus, she feels terrified again. In this case, she was attacked was the unconditioned stimulus. Terror was the unconditioned response. Bus in this case was conditioned stimulus and terror was conditioned response. Learning a conditioned response depends on the reinforcement. Reinforcement means strengthening the likelihood of a response. Classical condition is reinforced when the conditioned stimulus is followed immediately by the unconditioned stimulus. If conditioned stimulus no longer followed by unconditioned stimulus, then conditioned response fade and become extinct. For example, if Tom sees cat and he no longer sneezes, he won't leave the room. The disappearance of a previously learned response is called extinction. If conditioned stimulus presented again, then the conditioned response will reappear. This is called spontaneous recovery and refers to as the reappearance of a response which seemed to have been extinguished. Once a response to a conditioned stimulus is learned, the conditioned paradigm can be extended to include other stimuli as well. If a new neutral unconditioned stimulus is paired with the conditioned stimulus, the new stimulus can become a conditioned stimulus as well. This is also called higher order conditioning. Higher order conditioning means that conditioning goes one or more steps further than the original conditioning. For example, in Tom's case, mewing. The effect of a conditioned stimulus can be extended to include the other similar stimuli. This means that after the conditioning, stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimuli may also trigger the same response. This is called stimulus generalization, which refers to the tendency to respond to the similar but not identical stimuli. Stimulus generalization can also serve as an adaptive function because in everyday life we have to cope with a variety of stimuli. In contrast with stimulus discrimination also occurs. This means that the animal or a person can discriminate or detect difference among similar stimuli and only respond to a specific one. When stimulus discrimination occurs, the animal or the person that has learned to respond to a particular stimulus does not respond with same response to a new or similar stimuli. For example, in Tom's case, he will leave the room if he sees long-haired cats and not kittens or mule. So this is called the stimulus discrimination. Operant conditioning is another form of learning by association. In operant conditioning, the learning that takes place depends on the consequence of the response that person makes. For example, learning may take place because a certain type of response is rewarded or punished. In operant conditioning, responses are most often voluntary. Operant conditioning does not always involve producing an action. It sometimes involves withholding an action or not responding. For example, if you get an electric shock each time you touch an electric fence, you will learn not to touch that fence again. This is a form of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is based on the notion that behavior that are reinforced or rewarded are likely to be repeated and the behavior that are punished are not. Remember also that rewards do not mean the same thing to everyone. For example, if a child does not like the green sweet and you offer one as a reward for a good behavior, you may find that the reward does not work. This is why it is better to talk about a reinforcer rather than a reward. A reinforcer is anything that follows a response and increases the likelihood that desired response will occur again. Reinforcer is most effective if it occurs directly after the desired response. If a behavior is no longer reinforced, it becomes extinguished gradually. Reinforcement can be of two types. It can be positive or negative. Positive reinforcement occurs when a pleasant or desirable reinforcer follows a response. And negative reinforcement occurs when making a response removes an unpleasant event. For example, if you take a pill that relieves a headache, you learn through operant conditioning that your action of taking a pill removes an unpleasant event, the headache. A negative reinforcer increases the likelihood of a response but does so because the response ends the unpleasant event. A negative reinforcement is different to punishment. Punishment refers to an unpleasant consequence of a response. If you had to pay a fine every time you said a swear word, the fine would be a punishment. Punishment decreases the likelihood that response will occur again, whereas negative reinforcement increases the likelihood of a response. Operant conditioning can also take place if reinforcement is not continuous, that is, if every response is not reinforced. We call this partial reinforcement, which means that reinforcement does not follow every response and only some are reinforced. The different schedules of reinforcement are fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval reinforcement schedules. Fixed ratio schedule. This means that a fixed number of responses must be made in order to obtain reinforcement. Fixed ratio schedules generally produce a good response rate because the reinforcement is predictable. You could use a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement to change everyday behavior. Variable ratio schedule vary the number of responses before behavior is reinforced. For example, gambling will eventually win, so you keep on trying. Variable ratio schedule also produce good responses rate. In everyday life, payout from a slot machine are example of a variable ratio schedule reinforcement. Fixed interval schedules. The word interval refers to the passage of time, so reinforcement according to a fixed interval schedule is reinforcement that is produced for the first correct response after a certain amount of time has passed. Fixed interval schedule produce a moderately good rate of responding, but responses generally occurs in spurts. Variable interval schedule. This is a variation of fixed interval schedule reinforcement is given for the first correct response after a different intervals of time. Variable interval schedule produces a slow steady response rate that is strongly resistant to extinction. Schedules of reinforcement do not work in the same way with punishment. In order to be effective, punishment also occurs only after the undesired response. The effectiveness of punishment depends on timing, consistency, and intensity. This means that punishment is effective if it occurs each time the undesirable response occurs, immediately after the undesirable response occurs, and if it is severe enough. If you have to use punishment, some guidelines to bear in mind are: do not use punishment if you can stop bad behavior in other ways, such as praising good behavior. Punish during or immediately after the bad behavior. For example, if a child does something wrong, point it out immediately and do not threaten to tell someone about it later on. Use the least possible amount of punishment that will change the behavior. Punishment should be strong enough to stop the bad behavior but not excessive. For example, verbal scolding or taking away privileges is preferable to the physical punishment. Be consistent. Every incident of the bad behavior should be punished. In the case of parents, both parents should agree on the punishment. Expect the punished person to feel angry. Punishment should be aimed at the bad behavior and not at the child. Try to be kind and respectful. The aim of punishment should be able to help the person concerned and not to give vent to your own feeling. Make the effort to reinforce good or desirable behavior. It is easier and more effective to strengthen and encourage desired behavior than to punish undesired behavior. Cognitive factors influences the process of learning. In classical and operant conditioning, thinking, a cognitive process, plays a role on low level of awareness. There are other forms of learning that involves thinking at a higher level. In general terms, cognitive learning refers to understanding, knowing, anticipating, or otherwise making use of information-rich higher mental processes to facilitate learning. This implies that for learning to occur, the relationship between stimuli or between behavior and the consequences has to be assessed. This means that the cognitive learning is the result of thinking and other cognitive processes. One example of cognitive learning is to use cognitive maps to represent the environment in which we live in. A cognitive map is a mental representation of the spatial feature of an area, a building, or even the content of a book. Cognitive map generally refers to the geographical area, such as mental map of, of route to the home or environment you live in. However, there are different kinds of cognitive map. When studying, many students find it useful to draw diagrams showing how concepts fit together, and this is also a form of cognitive maps. Perceptual motor skills. Perceptual motor skills are based on motor movement that are guided by the perception. For example, playing tennis. Learn each skill verbally, then associate skills until they become automatic. When you learn a perceptual motor skill, the first phase involves cognitive processes. You may have a verbal plan to guide you after that. Intellectual skills. Intellectual skills are learned and we never stop learning. We learn by associating one thing with another or by discriminating between different things. We form concepts to represent things and we learn rules for using the concept to think and reason. On the highest level, we can think about your own thinking. Metacognition means knowledge of your own cognitive or mental processes. The acquisition of verbal skill is an example of learning intellectual skills. Much of the cognitive learning takes place through understanding. Formal study at university is a form of cognitive learning. At times, we have all learned things by repetition and memorization, but learning is more lasting and effective when we discover information on our own. Discovery learning refers to skills gained by insight and understanding through trying new strategies and discovering new solutions. The first year course in psychology is based on guided discovery. Students are given guidance and encouragement while also having the freedom to think actively about solving problems and thereby to gain useful knowledge. Social learning refers to the way we learn through interacting with other people. It illustrates the fact that not all learning is formal but also happens informally in everyday life. One of the ways in which social learning takes place is through operant social learning. For example, young children may be given stars at school to encourage their efforts. In other words, we learn socially acceptable or desirable behavior through being rewarded or appropriate behavior and being punished for bad behavior. The effectiveness of social reinforcement also depends on the other factors such as type of reinforcement that is offered and the strength of motivation to produce the socially desirable results. Another way that social learning occurs is through observation. Observational learning means learning by watching and imitating the behavior of others and observing the consequence of those actions. Observational learning occurs when the way we behave or respond is influenced by the observing other who are called models. The models serve as an example and through observation the observer may learn new responses, learn when those responses are appropriate and learn general rules that can be applied to different situations. Albert Bandura studied observational learning extensively. According to Bandura, there are four essential components to the observational learning. Attention. You must pay attention to the model's behavior and the consequence of that behavior. Retention. Another word for retention is keeping or saving. You must save a mental representation of what you have observed in order to be able to use it at a later stage. Reproduction. You must be able to reproduce the observed behavior that you have stored in your memory. Motivation. You will only reproduce behavior you have observed if you are motivated to do so. That is, if the response of your behavior will be worthwhile. Learning that is not apparent because it is not yet demonstrated is called latent learning or hidden learning. Performance on a test is an indication of only some of your information or knowledge. A great deal of what we have learned is never used, mostly because we have not had the occasion to do so. Although the different type of learning are discussed separately, it is clearly that there are many overlaps. For example, there is an element of cognitive learning in conditioning. In addition, social learning may be regarded as form of cognitive learning. At times, social learning also rests on the operant conditioning principles. This brings us to the end of learning in memory. If you like my video, don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you.